months ago, I was having dinner with my son Tommy and two of his friends from college. We were talking about their classes and their social lives, and the conversation turned to a friend of theirs who had recently passed away. He had overdosed on Xanax and alcohol and was found by his roommates one morning, dead in his bed. Tommy and his friends were devastated. By all accounts, this was a really great kid who had a lot going for him, and they couldn't believe that he was suddenly just gone. They were sad, of course, but what really struck me was that they didn't seem that surprised. And that's not because they suspected that this particular kid was in trouble, but because they had been here before. This was not the first friend that they had lost, and they knew that it wouldn't be the last. I asked them, I said, how many friends did they know who had personally died, who they personally knew who had died of suicide or drug overdose? And they started to name names, recount stories, and add them up. After a few minutes, they responded, 9. Between these 3 college-age kids, they personally knew 9 friends who had died of suicide or drug overdose. And these are kids who grew up in a relatively privileged environment, where most kids are sheltered from real hardship and have access to expensive psychiatrists and addiction specialists. I was astounded. And to be honest, my fear was that one of them would be next. So I asked them, I said, what do you think is going on? Why are so many of your friends suffering and, well, dying? And they just articulated so well what I think all of us know is true. There is too much pressure and uncertainty in today's world. Too many distractions and just way too much noise. They talked about feeling constantly stressed, overly busy, and often unmotivated. And they talked about feeling isolated and lonely at times, despite being surrounded by people. And what they were saying, which I think most of us can resonate with, is that they feel disconnected from each other, from nature, and from something or just really anything that feels bigger and more meaningful than themselves. Now, this conversation had a really profound impact on me, and I wanted to know more about mental health, why so many people are suffering, and what we can do about it. And I began to wonder whether this experience of feeling disconnected that they were describing might have something to do with it. Whether we might be able to improve our mental health by creating deeper connections and cultivating moments of meaning that help us bridge the difficult times and celebrate the joy in our lives. So I decided to do what I do for a living, which is to study it. And through my research, I really discovered 3 key things. The first is that we are in the midst of a mental health crisis. In fact, many have called it a mental health epidemic. The second thing I learned is that this is going to be a very difficult problem to address because mental health is complicated. But the third thing that I discovered is that there is something that every single one of us can do to help ourselves and to help each other. And that's to practice cultivating meaningful connections in our lives. So let me start with my first discovery. The fact of the matter is, we are in the midst of a mental health crisis. There is no denying that. It is getting progressively worse, and it impacts every single one of us, either directly or indirectly. The numbers are just staggering. Over the last 2 years, more than 40% of US adults have reported symptoms of anxiety or depression. 40%. And the outlook isn't that much better for the rest of us. According to well-known psychologist Adam Grant, those of us who aren't acutely suffering from anxiety or depression are just simply languishing, muddling our way through our day, feeling stagnant and empty, waiting for work to end so we can go home and soothe ourselves with a giant glass of wine, or maybe check out from life for a few hours by binge watching the next best show on Netflix. The fact is, only a minority of people with symptoms seek mental health treatment. The rest of us just suffer silently or make desperate attempts to self-medicate. And it is exactly this kind of silent suffering and these desperate attempts to self-medicate that Tommy and his friends were describing that night at dinner, and that led to the death of 9 of their friends before they turned 20. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death in 10 to 24-year-olds. And globally, somebody kills themselves every 40 seconds, which means in the very short time since I've started talking, 8 people have died from suicide, and we will lose another 16 by the time I'm done. Now, the second thing that I learned in my research is that this is going to be a problem that is very difficult to solve because mental health is complicated and it has many contributing factors, including genetics, chemical imbalances in the brain, stressful life events, and trauma, to name a few. And in order to address it, it is going to require a massive, coordinated public health effort. I do not want to oversimplify this. We need to reduce stigma, increase access to care, and continue to develop effective therapeutics. We need to reform our entire education systems to focus more on social and emotional learning so that our children have the skills to cope with adversity. And we need to address structural violence and social injustices which have plagued our society and our healthcare systems for generations. But there may be another, deeper root cause of our current mental health crisis. And that is the fact that so many people are moving through their lives feeling disconnected in the way that my son Tommy and his friends were talking about that night at dinner. It turns out that feeling disconnected is actually really bad for your mental health. Our own research confirms what others have suggested in the literature, which is that people who feel more disconnected have more burnout and clinically significant anxiety and depression, while those who feel more connected have less. What's more, the more experiences of meaningful connection that you have in your life, the greater your life satisfaction. And meaningful is really key to the kind of connection that I'm talking about. That kind of connection can feel profound, even transformative. It gives our lives meaning. It's the kind of connection that you may experience when you quiet yourself in meditation, for those of you who meditate, or just hold the hand of somebody that you love and watch a sunrise together. You can even experience this kind of connection in grief. I personally had the experience of feeling deeply, profoundly connected while watching my own mother die. The importance and the power of this kind of connection really resonated with me. Because in a previous life, before I went to law school or got my PhD, and before I became an academic researcher, I spent several years traveling to the Amazon rainforest to study with indigenous communities. I was very interested in the healing practices of local shaman and the beliefs that inform those practices. During this time, I visited many different shaman from different communities, all with slightly different healing modalities, some a little less comfortable than others. But what they had in common was that they were all deeply, meaningfully, and profoundly connected. And regardless of their methods, an essential component of their practice was to create this experience of connection, not just for the individuals who sought out their help, but also with them. So fast forward about 20 years to a time in my life when I myself was experiencing anxiety and depression. When my marriage began to fall apart, people told me that it would be difficult, but really nobody could have possibly prepared me for the devastation that I felt. I remember one day in particular, I was literally lying on my closet floor, and I was hiding from my 3 kids so they wouldn't see me hyperventilating and sobbing my way through my 3rd panic attack of the day. And just as I started to kind of breathe a little more calmly, this idea kind of popped into my head, and this voice said, "Man, you got to make some friends." Now, I immediately dismissed this idea because I actually had a lot of friends. I also had a very large community of colleagues at work, and I had an amazingly loving and supportive family. But what I meant, what I was acknowledging in that moment, was that I needed to create more moments of meaning in my life. Lying on that closet floor with my entire reality shattered, the only thing that I knew for certain was that if I wanted to survive this, I was going to have to consciously, intentionally, and proactively create more moments of meaning in my life. And so I decided to revisit the lessons that I clearly had not learned 20 years earlier. And I went back to the Amazon to study with the very people who tried to teach me this important lesson about connection so long ago. One of my most recent trips was to Peru. And while I was there, I met a man named Basilio. Basilio is from a small village, and he is just an extraordinary human being. You can tell from his smile, right? I mean, he's just full of joy. I was immediately drawn to Basilio, even though we don't speak the same language, because he is intimately connected with nature. In fact, he considers himself an intermediary between human beings and Mother Earth. And I wanted to understand what it is about Basilio that enables him to live his life feeling so connected. And what I learned from him and from others like him is that there are really 3 key practices that can be cultivated to create meaningful connection. The first is that you have to be mindful enough to be fully present. It turns out that you can't actually connect with anyone or anything while multitasking. And believe me, I have tried. And that includes multitasking in your brain, right? So if you're listening to somebody share with you their experience or tell you what their perspective is, and you're plotting out what your response is going to be, you're not actually being fully present. The second thing is that you have to be courageous enough to be vulnerable, to stop worrying so much about being judged, and to stop judging yourself so that you can show up authentically, warts and all, perfectly imperfect. And finally, you have to have enough humility to be empathetic. We live in a society right now where everything feels incredibly divisive, and everybody is more entrenched than ever in their own personal beliefs. Now, I'm not saying that we all have to agree with each other, but we do have to have the humility to accept that regardless of our beliefs, we are no better than anyone else. And we have to have the capacity to truly understand what other people are experiencing in order to deeply connect with them. Now, when I was lying on my closet floor, face wet with tears, reeling with anxiety, if you were to have said to me, all you need is deep connection and to suspend judgment, there is no way I could have even imagined it possible. Because deeply connecting and creating moments of meaning is a practice, and it needs to be cultivated. It takes time, it takes intention, and it takes love. Connecting with each other is really just another way of loving one another. And it's something that we often forget to do in our busy, task-filled days. I believe that we can improve our collective mental health by creating deeper connections and by cultivating moments of meaning that help us bridge the difficult times and ultimately celebrate the joy in our lives. And we can do that by practicing being fully present, vulnerable, and empathetic. So I invite you to give it a try. Pick up the phone and call someone you love or someone you want to love tonight. Or better yet, FaceTime them so you can look them in the eyes. Show up and be completely present. Suspend judgment. Take a risk and be vulnerable. And do your best to communicate with empathy. You might just both feel a little bit better. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us practice this on a regular basis, my children's children will not be able to name 9 friends who died of suicide or drug overdose by the time they're 20. Thank you.